Give a round of applause for Susan Shelley. She's the Assembly candidate and is the author of 3 books of the U.S. Constitution. They have been acquired by many university, state college, and public libraries across the United States, Canada, and New Zealand. Often used by homeschool and online school, high school government classes, the books were also on the reading list in a class on wrongful convictions in Northern Arizona University Department of Criminology. Drawing on the research for the books, Susan wrote newspaper op-ed articles and a blog about issues related to constitutional rights. She became personally involved in politics in 2010 as the volunteer director of communications for the Republican congressional candidate David Benning. In 2012, she ran for Congress, herself against rival Democratic incumbents Howard Berman and Brad Sherman, winning the endorsement of the Los Angeles Daily News, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, and the California Republican League. At the urging of many community leaders, Susan ran for the California Assembly in a 2013 special election and came within 329 votes of victory in a district where Democrats outnumbered Republicans 2-to-1 margin. Ms. Shelley has a BA in history from CSUN and was the associate producer of the game show Jeopardy! Give a round of applause for Susan Shelley, everybody.
I want to talk to you about the California budget and why education is always such an issue and why it never gets fixed. How many of you heard that we have a balanced budget in California, or even a surplus? Have you heard that? How many of you believe it? So smart you are. Professor Rob is so good. We do not have a balanced budget. The governor's budget says that we have a $354 billion debt and unfunded liability. $354 billion. And that is money that is owed from this department to that department, money that is owed to the federal government for paying unemployment benefits, because we didn't have enough money to pay unemployment benefits because there's so much unemployment in this state. Some of it is owed for health care benefits for state workers. A lot of it is owed for pensions. A huge amount of unfunded liability for pensions. So what is going on with the budget? Let me show you. Let me bring in a table and show you. Bring in a table. I'm going to show you, carnival style, why education is always in trouble in California. Here we have, this is all the cash that comes into California, monopoly money. That's the way they do it. This is the general fund. Here's the money that's in the general fund. And here's more money that's coming in from higher taxes. We'll leave that right there for a moment. Now over here we have, all set up for you. Over here we have the public safety budget, and over here we have the education budget, and over here we have unfunded pensions. We just owe a lot of money in unfunded pensions. It's far in the future, or is it? Every time a teacher retires and they draw a pension, somebody's got to write that check, and that check has to clear. So what happened here is that the money comes into the general fund, and they put some in the public safety budget, and they put some in the education budget, and of course it's never enough. So what they do is they say to the voters, we want you to pass bond issues. We want to borrow money, and we want to have bonds for education. But don't worry, we're going to earmark the money for education. We're going to fold it down and make sure, we're going to have an audit, and make sure that all that money that you voted for education goes to education. And they put this earmarked money for education into the education budget. But look, this money they put in last year, this isn't earmarked. They take that right out of the budget. So you're never ahead. They take the money out of the budget that they put in last year, they put it in pensions. And more money comes in. Prop 30, more money comes in. Okay, this money is earmarked for education. We're going to fold the corner down. You're going to know that those dollars you pay for Prop 30 are for education. There it is. But look, this money is not earmarked. No folded corner there. That can go in pensions. And this has been going on year after year, decade after decade. I've got a list here in the book Taxophornia of all the propositions for education funding that have been passed. Oh, I'm not going to bother reading it to you. Just take my word for it. Here we go. There were 2 in 1972, 1 in 1974, 1 in 1982, 1 in 1984, 2 in 1986, 3 in 1988. Some of you may start to remember voting for some of these, and where is the money? Why are we still seeing the commercials that show the cockroaches in the bathrooms and they never fix the schools? Why? Okay, they show the commercial again. People vote for more money. They voted for it in 88, they voted for it in 1990. 4 more in 1996, another one in 1998. Now, one of the things they did in 1998 is they got so tired of this nonsense that they said, okay, half the general fund, I think the actual figure is 40%, but if the economy does well, it's a little more, something like that. There's a formula. Half of the money in the general fund, roughly, must go to education. There it is. It's going to education. And so the tax revenue comes in, and it goes into the general fund. But look, the legislature's too smart for us. They created special funds. And they took the money out of the general fund, and they put it into special funds. They took about half the money out of the general fund, put it into special funds, and what did they divide up for education? Just what's left. And education is always in trouble, because the voters will pass bond issues and higher taxes for education, because the voters care about education. Everybody cares about education, except the politicians, who only use it as an excuse to get higher taxes, which they then spend on pensions. Just recently, after Prop 30 passed, the legislature gave itself raises, it gave the staff of the legislature raises, it gave the 99,000 workers in SEIU 1000, the local that represents white-collar workers in Sacramento, raises, and higher pension costs. And there it goes. And it's never enough. It's never enough, because the pensions are bottomless. It's a bottomless pit of debt, which we are all inheriting. And this is the problem with the California budget. They are pretending that they have a surplus by taking all of these things off the table and looking only at the cash coming in and the cash going out, and they say, aha, we're balanced. But we're not balanced because of this. We're not balanced. Education's not free. Teachers don't work for free. People have to be paid. And this is an expense of our society, and we are happy to pay it. We are happy to pay for education. Over and over again, bond issues for education. Where's the money? Why doesn't it get better? It's because the people in Sacramento do not value education, and they are not taking good care of their constituents, and they are not representing you well. And we can do better in California. And we have to do better in California. Okay, I'm done with this table. I'll call in my stagehands to take the table away. So let me talk briefly about some of the things we can do to make the economy better in California so that there's more tax revenue coming in the normal way, and we can pay for education, we can pay for all the things in the social safety net that we want to pay for. We're always going to have a social safety net in this state. We're never going to be the kind of society that just lets people fall. But it's an expense. We have to pay for it. It's an act of generosity, and it's an expense. It's not a right to have health care. Somebody has to provide health care. If you have a right to health care, what about the doctor's rights? How are you going to get people to be doctors if they're not compensated at the level that justifies as much work and liability as they have, as much education and training, the hours they put in? We can't just order people to be doctors because people have a right to health care. These are things that have to be paid for. And we do want to pay for them, and we need economic growth to do it. So let me explain just a couple of things quickly that we could do in California that would make our economy better. In 2006, a law was passed to try and prevent global warming. And one of the things that it did was raise the target for using renewable fuels, wind and solar, in electrical utilities from 20% to 33%. So all the utilities in California had to go out and sign long-term contracts for wind and solar energy to meet this state mandate, which was a number pulled right out of the air. 33% by the year 2020 was just made up. I mean, there was nothing scientifically required that it had to be 33% by the year 2020. That was the number they chose. That was the bill that passed in 2006. Your utility bills, everybody's utility bills, started going up because wind and solar is expensive. This is an expensive source of power, particularly when everyone in the state is bidding for it at the same time. It's very expensive. And what have we accomplished year after year, paying these higher utility bills, which, by the way, raise the cost of the schools, raise the cost of the business. Anybody who has to keep the lights on is paying a higher utility bill, and that is money that's not available for other things that are a priority. What are we accomplishing by doing this? Are we saving the earth? If we in California go from a 20% target for solar and wind to a 33% target for solar and wind, does it make any difference in the climate? They're not doing it anywhere else. It's just us doing this. So we make California less competitive for businesses. We make everything more expensive for people who live here. And what do we accomplish with that? Nothing. Let's go back to the 20% target. That was fine. It's only been since 2006. We can go back to the 20% target. We can take that upward pressure off energy costs. That would be like a tax cut for every business in California and for every household in California. And nothing bad would happen. Nobody's benefits would be cut. Nobody's taxes would be raised. That would be better. That's something we can do. We can also do something that Texas did. They did something about their litigation climate. Businesses in Texas no longer have to worry about frivolous lawsuits, and so their insurance is less expensive. So it's less expensive to do business in Texas. It could be less expensive to do business here in California. We could do something about our litigation climate. We could do something to improve our business climate. And one of the things that would improve the business climate is to leave Proposition 13 alone. Because Proposition 13 protects property owners from having higher property taxes every year based on the market value of their property. Now, when you own a piece of property, you own it. It's not income coming in, you just own it. And property taxes are a tax on owning what you already own. So if you tax a business on the value of its property, what's going to happen? They're going to have to raise their prices, they're going to have to pay their employees less, they're going to have to do something to come up with the money to pay those taxes every year. How does that help us? When you're out there looking for a job, how does it help to raise taxes on businesses? It doesn't. It doesn't. If you raise taxes on commercial real estate, oh, it sounds evil, commercial real estate. I heard all those people before talking about that, commercial interests. Okay, so you raise money, you raise the taxes on commercial real estate every year. Every year it's appraised, every year you raise the taxes. What happens to the dry cleaners and the restaurant and the tailor shop? What happens to them? All their rents are going to go up. Well, how much is it going to cost to get your suit cleaned if their rent goes up every year based on the market value of property, something over which they have no control? So if we want to improve the business climate in California, it would really help to protect Proposition 13 and stop telling people that we must raise taxes on businesses. If you were opening a business right now, would you want it to be in California with that kind of conversation going on? Would you be looking down the road and saying, I'm not sure I can afford to stay in this state next year if they do this? Would you go to Texas? Toyota just did. Toyota just closed. They just announced this week they're closing their sales and administrative facility in Torrance, California, and they are moving it to Plano, Texas, with over 5,000 jobs. They're leaving California. They're going to Texas. Why? It's too expensive to do business in California. We're just hurting ourselves with these policies.
Right.
The answer is economic growth. With more economic growth, there's more tax revenue coming in. There's more money for the social safety net. There's more money for education. There's enough to go around when things are growing. It takes a lot of pressure off our society on so many issues, including immigration. If people can find jobs, if people feel prosperous, and they don't feel so frightened and anxious. And rightly so. Things are pretty scary in California, and it doesn't have to be like this. You deserve better.
Yeah.
We can do better. And I hope that you'll support me on June 3rd. I hope you're all registered to vote, and I hope you'll go out and vote on June 3rd, Susan Shelley for Assembly. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
I'll answer your questions all the way along.
We have some questions from students.
Okay.
So, almost all the students asked this in Denise Rob's class, and they said, what's your position on Obamacare, and specifically the state's implementation of it?
Well, let me tell you something about Covered California. Covered California has a big subsidy from the federal government for its first year of operation. And what they said just recently is that when that subsidy runs out at the end of a year, they are insolvent. Insolvent. Unless they get more sign-ups from young people at the projected level that they need, they will not have enough money to pay the claims of the people who are currently in the system. They are insolvent. It's not so much a question of whether everyone wants to have health care. We want all these problems solved. But if there's no money to pay the claims, if there's no money to pay the doctors, what are we going to do? Are we just going to keep grinding the doctors down until they all leave the field and go into real estate? We can do that. They can leave in an instant. You could wake up one morning and your doctor could say, I'm not taking any new patients, I'm not taking any old patients, I'm closing my practice. That's happening. And it's not funny because to say that Obamacare is a success based on how many people sign up for it is only 1/3 of the story. The other 2/3 are, do you have a job? And do you have a doctor? Because if you don't have a job, if your employer laid people off because they can't afford to pay the benefits and the taxes and the compliance paperwork and all the rest under Obamacare, and they're firing people or cutting everyone back to part-time, what have you gained? If you have an assurance of health insurance, okay, great, that's very nice, we'll all sleep better for 2 or 3 nights, but then you lose your job. So it's a complex picture. And if you have insurance and you go looking for a doctor, and every doctor's office you call says, we don't take covered California, which is what I'm hearing from people. We don't take covered California. And we're only seeing Medicare patients 1 day a week. And we're only seeing Medi-Cal patients 1 day a week. And there's a 6-month waiting list for an appointment. Are you ahead? These things have consequences. Obamacare was not well thought out. It was a compromise between things that are not really easily reconciled. There are a lot of contradictions in it. Most of them are in the math department. You know, you can say that Obamacare doesn't violate the Constitution if you want to, but it certainly violates the laws of mathematics. There will never be enough money to go around to give everybody everything they want at everybody else's expense. You won't have doctors, you won't have nurses, you won't have hospitals, they'll be closing, and we'll all be waiting in line for medical care. And you'll have to call a congressman to get a favor, to get a doctor to see you. That's not how it ought to be. And this is the problem with Obamacare. Good intentions, but it doesn't work out the way they said it would.
All right, next question. How would you deal with homelessness and poverty in California?
I would deal with homelessness and poverty through economic growth. We need more jobs in California. We absolutely need more jobs. And let me segue into the minimum wage question, because many people feel that raising the minimum wage will solve some of the problems of poverty. But the trouble with raising the minimum wage is that it doesn't create the money to pay the wage. So you don't ever really accomplish what you're seeking to accomplish. The way to raise wages and end poverty in California is to have so much work and so much business and so much economic growth that there are people at tables out there from Boeing and Rocketdyne and Westfield asking people to sign job applications because they're desperate for workers. And then wages rise through competition for workers. We need a labor shortage. We don't have a labor shortage, we have a job shortage. And one of the reasons we have a job shortage is policies like Obamacare, which make it so expensive to hire people that they're laying everybody off and cutting them back to part-time, which causes poverty. People who can't get full-time jobs can't pay their bills. This is a problem. So the issues of homelessness that are related to mental health and other issues that are non-economic, those have other problems, other solutions. Those are things that are part of the social safety net. These are expenses that our society wants to pay. And once again, we can pay it if we have enough economic growth, so there's enough tax revenue so we can pay for education and health care and the social safety net. Economic growth is really the solution to the whole problem, to all the problems.
Thank you.
Here's a fun question. Who will you be voting for the governor of California?
I decline to answer that question.
All right, here's another good one. What do you think about hybrid and electric cars and the state subsidies for these cars and their ability to drive with single occupants in a high occupancy vehicle lane?
Well, they're very expensive, and when people buy them, they want to feel like they're getting some benefit out of it. So I understand that people want to use the high occupancy vehicle lane, and I suppose that's okay. I'm not a tremendous fan of government subsidies of this kind of technology because
Thank you.
I don't think it. You know, let me tell you something about renewable energy. This is a book from 1981 called Energy, Vulnerability, and War. And the whole book is arguing for renewable fuels, for wind, solar, electric cars, this kind of thing. The whole book is arguing for it. Why? I looked in the index to see if they had global warming, and they don't. What they have in this book is global weaponry. This whole book was about how we must go to wind and solar. We must have government subsidies for wind and solar and electric cars, ethanol-type fuels, and all the rest of it. We must have government subsidies for that because of the risk of nuclear war. Well, that's convenient. Now that we don't have the imminent risk of nuclear war because the Cold War is over, we've got global warming. And exactly the same argument. We must have subsidies for electric cars. We must have subsidies for renewable fuels. Somebody's trying to sell windmills. Somebody's trying really hard to sell windmills, and they can't do it, and they want the government to subsidize windmills and solar panels. One of the things about windmills and solar panels that is worth looking at is how much physical land it takes to generate enough power for a city. The amount of land that it takes for those windmills or solar panels is enormous. And we have many different uses for land. You know, there's cattle ranching, and there's development, and there's farming, and there's all these different things that we can be doing with land besides turning it over to solar panels and wind. So these are complicated priority fights. People want to argue about how the land should be used, the federal lands, and whether we're getting our money's worth out of it. And when you deal with something like wind, you have to have transmission lines. The transmission lines go through the backyards of people who are really not a party to it. You know, they're not making any money off selling the land for the windmills, and they're not getting the power. They're just in the path with transmission lines going through their property. They're not happy about that. You have a lot of political resistance to the whole thing, which just increases the pressure for government subsidies because you have to start paying people off to allow it. And it's just not, the numbers just don't really add up. And it's been decades and decades that people have been trying to tell us that this is the future. Let me tell you what the future really is. The future is safe use of fossil fuels. When this book was written, they said we were going to run out of oil in 70 years. And that book was written in 1981. And now we know we were not running out of oil. We were not running out of natural gas. That was not the case. We need to update some of our legislation to reflect the new knowledge that we have about our energy resources. Of course, we want everything to be safe. There's no debate there at all. We want safe water. We want clean air. But if we can use the resources in North America safely and not rely on foreign oil from these volatile areas, think of the difference it would make. Think of the difference it would make if we didn't have these pressures to go to war, to protect oil, to protect the shipping lanes for oil, because we had it here. Because the world had a stable, predictable, politically secure source of energy. Just let your mind go to work on that. Wouldn't that solve a lot of problems? And isn't it worth looking at it and not just being scared and using phrases like the city council did, oh, it's Frankenstein science. It's not Frankenstein science. Of course we want it to be safe. There's no purpose, there's nothing to be gained by being reflexively afraid of science and technology. Science and technology solve a lot of problems for us. And you can make things sound very scary if you want to do a scary commercial or a documentary. Right. How scary would chemotherapy be if you did one of these political TV commercials and said, oh, we want to ban chemotherapy? Chemotherapy is no fun. It's very scary. Why do we do it? Because it saves lives. And if we can do fracking safely, and we can have a stable, politically secure source of fossil fuels, and we can find a way to burn them cleanly, and we can solve these problems with technology, isn't it worth the effort? I think it is. I think that's the real future. And solar and wind is the old-fashioned future, like aluminum foil clothes and flying cars. It's the 1950s idea of what the future will be.
Who is your favorite Supreme Court justice and why?
You know, you guys have asked me that question at least once before. I'm not a fan of Supreme Court justices as individuals. I have a high regard for the institution. They have done important work in bringing parts of the Constitution forward into the present that needed to be brought forward into the present. There are many occasions when the American people don't want to amend the Constitution, which is the constitutional way to update it, and people don't want to, and the Supreme Court has moved in some cases to effectively amend the Constitution. Sometimes that's been a good thing, sometimes that's been a bad thing. It's not the deal we signed. The deal we signed is we should have constitutional amendments, and we should all talk about it in our state legislatures, and then what the Supreme Court does will be much less controversial. But because the American people have not chosen to amend the Constitution and have these debates in their political institutions, we get it in the judicial institutions. And that has unintended consequences, but that's a complicated subject and we should get into it.
What new environmental protection laws would you like to see here in California? And what would you do about California's drought? And your thoughts on fracking?
Well, we've covered fracking. I think if we can do it safely, we should do it. The drought is actually our climate. Our climate in Southern California is a desert, and drought is the natural part of the natural cycle. So it's not like there's something weird about the weather and we have a drought. We have historically wet years and dry years. And what we have to have is water storage and intelligent water management policies for all of the different priorities. And some of the priorities are agriculture, some are urban development, some are commercial uses, some is species preservation, and we have to sit down across the table from each other and talk rationally about it. I personally think that the Endangered Species Act led us in California to a disastrous situation.
True.
Over protecting of fish and destroying farmland, destroying old trees and destroying farmland. We don't want to destroy the food supply in California. That's not rational. And you know, we want to protect species, we want to protect fish. I have nothing against fish. I don't even care if they're small fish. I think size doesn't matter that much. And small should be protected as well. But these are decisions that we have to make in the daylight. We have to sit across the table from each other and say, now, do we want to go down this path and shut off the water to Fresno and Bakersfield and shut down all these farms? What's that going to do to the cost of food? Another example that's raising the cost of food is a trucking regulation that's requiring diesel trucks to put very expensive filters on that the Air Resources Board in California has required.
That's right.
And this is really killing truckers, and so they have to raise the rates for everything that comes into California on a truck. Everything that moves in California is more expensive because of these regulations for diesel particulate matter. And it may be that the science is very flawed on this. I've been reading up on it, and there are some serious questions about whether the science has been transparent and whether it is legitimate or whether it is manipulated. And honestly, when you look at something that's raising the cost of food in California, you have to look at that aspect also. Certainly it's very important to have clean air. We all agree it's important to have clean air. It's not necessarily a good idea to make a trucker pay $26,000 for a filter for his truck for something that is only a fraction of the diesel particulate problem. Most of it is coming over the ocean from China.
Good point.
And hassling our truckers is only raising the cost of doing business in California. So this is an environmental law that I would like to see changed. I think that the diesel particulate standard that the California Air Resources Board has put in place may be not necessary. And perhaps at this point, some of the companies that make the filters are influencing the decision to keep the requirement. And this is something that we should look at, because everybody in California who goes to a grocery store is really hurting. Boy, things are expensive in this state.
Truly.
And it's pretty tough. So you talk about poverty, that's one of the things that makes poverty worse is high food costs. And when you have environmental policies that make food costs higher, we should hit the brakes for a minute and we should look at what we're doing to ourselves. Much of what is going on in California is self-inflicted damage. Not just a drought, but self-inflicted damage from bad policies, which could be changed and should be changed.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to let the audience ask questions, so if you have a question,
Ask me anything.
but please come up to the microphone at the front here.
I heard that wind power is responsible for killing a lot of birds that fly into the zone.
Yes,
I'm
they
wondering
do.
why environmentalists are in favor of this.
That's a very good question. It's a very good question. I believe the government gave the wind farms an exemption from the Endangered Species Act because they were killing eagles. Did you hear that?
Oh, yeah.
This is There's a lot of money in subsidized energy. There's a lot of money in the subsidized energy business. And if you look up, go to your computer and look up on Google, wind farms, General Electric, subsidies, you can see that there's a lot of government help for companies that are selling alternative energy. And if it was helping us, that might be worthwhile, but I don't think it is helping us. I think it's just a lot of people making a lot of money on protected government compliance contracts. They're not so much businesses as they are government compliance vendors.
Good point.
Captain America.
Yes.
I like it.
My question is, what is your position on affirmative action, not only in the schools, but in employment as well?
I think it's time to be rid of affirmative action. I think it's over. I think we've done that for long enough, and there are people who are in the workforce today who have spent their entire adult life at a professional disadvantage because of their race and gender, and I don't think it's necessary any longer, and I think it's time for it to go. I believe that there should be no discrimination on the basis of race or gender in the United States of America.
Good. Thank you.
Hello there, Ms. Shelley. I just wanted to ask you, the demonstration that you gave us regarding the general fund and how much is allocated to education. Let's say you do win this election up in November. What will you do that will stop this fraud from taking place so that all of us who are direct beneficiaries of the state public school system, what are you going to do? How are you going to convince your colleagues who happen to, who take part in this fraud? What are you going to do to change their mindsets?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is we have to start someplace. If we don't start, we're not going to get there. I'm one person. But right now, in Sacramento, in the Assembly, there is a supermajority of one party. They have a 2/3 majority. They can vote for anything they want. No one can stop them. They can do things without hearings. They can pass blank legislation, which they are doing and filling it in later. They're called spot bills. You can look it up. They are passing blank legislation. That's another side. But they are, if we break the supermajority, it takes 2 seats to break the supermajority in the Assembly. And then there's a little bit of leverage to have hearings and to slow down some of these things that are so abusive. These abusive practices like gut and amend, where all the language is stripped out of a bill just before it's voted on. And it's voted on a completely different bill than what was circulated prior. That's just abusive. And these spot bills, why is it even legal to pass blank legislation or legislation with blanks in it where the dollar amount is supposed to be? Why is that even legal? Whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, why is the Assembly and the State Senate, why are they voting for blank legislation and filling it in back rooms and bringing it to the floor later for an up or down vote with no hearings, no amendments, no transparency? We can stop that with just 2 Assembly members. We can break the supermajority, we can have hearings, we can look at some of these things, and we can expose these practices. And as I said, we have to begin. This is a big project, but we have to begin.
Good point.
Now we'd like to put in a plug for Dr. Brown's handout. Did you see that great page she had on socialism and where it starts with good intentions and how it ends in Cuba and North Korea? Take a look at that. It was excellent.
It's a thing of beauty.
It's a thing of beauty.
So, as we lead up to the primary, I just wanted to know if you're going to be able to counter the argument that we have to get rid of Prop 13 because we have unusually low tax rates, property tax rates in California. I believe I read that even though our percentage property tax rates are low, because our property values are so high, we're actually in the top 10 when it comes to property taxes per household. So are you prepared to argue against the rapacious unions that want to retire at 50 and are living to 113? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I will protect Proposition 13. I will defend the rights of property owners to keep their homes and not be taxed out of their own property. I will fight for homeowners. I will fight to make sure that we do not make the business climate worse in California by raising taxes on businesses. I will protect Proposition 13. I'm very proud to be endorsed by the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association.
I know it's a violation of protocol for me to step to the microphone, but I've been musing over some of the ways things are done in Sacramento, in particular the legislative branch. And I have some concern about our members in the Assembly and in the Senate being participants on committees that require a great deal of time. And let's say, for example, there are 9 people on the committee, 7 of them are in one direction, 2 in the other direction, and those 2, which I'm probably in that camp, spend a great deal of time doing research and preparing a very fine statement before the camera, and knowing full well it's going nowhere. And those legislators are completely ignorant of what their constituents really want their money to be used. What are your thoughts about legislators getting off those absolutely time-consuming, energy-using committees and finding out what their constituents really want and representing their constituents?
Well, one of the things that will solve that problem is better people in Sacramento. We need better people in government. This is a public trust. They are spending your money, and you need trustworthy people who are listening to you, who understand the priorities in your life, and who don't just act out of self-interest, which happens very often. And they get a little too comfortable, they get a little too safe in those seats, and the voters have, in California, the voters have been trying to do something about it. We have term limits, we have the top 2 primary, we have citizen redistricting. All of these things are the voters saying, something's wrong, let's fix it. We need better people. And if you want to know the real thing that will fix it, the one real thing that will fix it, it's voter turnout.
That's right.
How many of you know somebody who didn't vote in, I don't know, the last election, the last 2 elections? Get them on the phone and tell them to register and vote. Because if people vote, it will change and it will get better. And if people don't vote, if they think, it doesn't matter, or it's only a primary, it doesn't matter, or it doesn't matter because it's not contested, it matters every time.
Yes.
Every time. If you leave these people alone and they think nobody's watching, they move stuff to the floor in the middle of the night. There was a bill that was going to make it easier to raise property taxes by passing infrastructure bonds with a 55% vote instead of a 2/3 vote. Currently, it takes a 2/3 vote to raise taxes. And passing bonds and parcel taxes, which raises property taxes, takes a 2/3 vote for everything except education. Education was changed a few years back to 55%. And now, they like that in Sacramento so much. Passing bonds and parcel taxes, borrowing more money, raising everybody's taxes, they like that so much. They want the limit, they want the threshold to be 55% for all these other bonds besides education.
That's right.
Like infrastructure bonds, and library bonds, and transportation bonds, and community development bonds, and bonds for any general purpose. Senate Constitutional Amendment 11, bonds for any general purpose, would pass with 55%. And one day, last June, on a Saturday, the Assembly brought to the floor Assembly Constitutional Amendment 8, which would bring the threshold down to 55% for passing bonds for infrastructure. And they passed it on a Saturday with no warning. And right now it's pending in the Senate. And that's the kind of thing that happens when they think nobody's watching, when they think the coast is clear. Let me tell you something. As long as I'm here, the coast will never be clear for tax increases. Want to know the difference one person can make? One person can stand up and say, no. One person can stand up and say, look what they're doing. Turn the lights on, open the windows. This can't continue. The voters of California deserve better representation. And they will get it. We're going to win this election.
I'd like to know what your ideas for the creation of jobs for us.
Well, one of the things that would create jobs is to make it less expensive to hire people in California, or to make it less expensive to do business in California. One of the easiest ways is what I talked about with the electricity bills, to go back to repeal the part of Assembly Bill 32 that took us to a 33% renewable fuel standard. That's driving up utility bills across California, which raises the price of everything, which makes it too expensive for everyone to do business. That would help. That would help businesses hire more people. It's just a fact that the Affordable Care Act has reduced hiring in America. It's just a fact. You can look it up. There are fewer jobs because it's more expensive to hire people. Now, a lot of people don't want to repeal the Affordable Care Act. They're afraid that there won't be health coverage for everyone. But we have to solve that problem differently, because if it hurts hiring, then we're not ahead. So those are two things that we should look at. If it was up to me, instead of passing the Affordable Care Act, we would have addressed just the problem of pre-existing conditions, and then a separate bill, just affordability, to deal with subsidies for people who can't pay those premiums. And a bill for the pre-existing conditions that spreads the risk so that people who are in that unfortunate situation can always get insurance and don't have to live in fear. And if we had done just those two things, we would be okay. But instead, they did this comprehensive bill, where everything is in it at the same time, and it has all these unintended consequences and all of these problems. And so one of the problems is there's less hiring, particularly in California, where it's more expensive for everything. It's more expensive for income taxes. We have the highest sales taxes. We have the highest gasoline taxes. Now we have the highest energy rates because of this global warming legislation. Global warming may be a problem, but how much are we paying for these things that are supposedly mitigating it? Just because we have a problem doesn't mean the solution they've given you is accurate. Doesn't mean it's working. Doesn't mean it's cost effective. So some of the things that they've told us we have to do to prevent global warming are bad policy ideas, and we should look at all of that. And that would all help hiring in California.
Thank you.
I was under the impression that this last tax raise that was passed was temporary, according to your
So they say,
opponent.
yeah.
According to your opponent last year, or whenever it was. And I'd like to know, since the Democrats, you say they're bragging that they balanced the budget, is it scheduled to go down the rates? And if it is, what is it scheduled to go down?
Well, the Prop 30 tax increase, which was on high incomes, and also it raised the sales tax. I forget if it was 7 years, 12 years, but it's temporary. What they're doing in Sacramento is they're spending the money with long-term programs. So they've given raises to themselves, raises to their staff, raises to the state white-collar workers. Those are permanent, those raises. Those are not temporary. And they're spending money on nonsense, like the bullet train. The bullet train is nonsense. We don't have money for a bullet train. And it's just a senseless expense. It's not what, first of all, the funding source is not there for it, which is why the courts have stepped in and stopped the bonds from being sold. There were $9 billion, I believe, in bonds that were going to be sold in California for the bullet train, and a judge has stopped them. So now there's $3 billion, $3.3 billion, I think, of federal money for the bullet train. And this is very much in jeopardy because if we don't have the money in California, the federal government won't give us the $3.3 billion in federal funds. So what's the governor doing? Is he folding it up and saying, well, I guess it's not a good time? Don't be silly. What the governor's doing is he's taking money out of the climate change money. There's a cap and trade fund where people are being taxed essentially for running their motors, and that money is sitting in a fund. And you can't leave a fund full of money anywhere near politicians.
That's right.
Because the governor is taking $250 million out of this climate change money, and he's going to use it for the bullet train. But why? Why? The first segment of the bullet train is $6 billion. We don't have it. Why do we need to spend $250,000? What are we buying with $250,000 for the bullet train? Oil paintings of how pretty it's going to look going through the wind farms? They're nice. You see those online? They're beautiful. You should have one over your fireplace. It costs you enough.
Good point.
All right, everybody, that's a wrap up for today. Please give a round of applause to Susan Shelley, the 45th Assembly candidate.
To our events, there's a sign-up sheet over there. I'll invite you to all the stuff we're doing, and I hope to see you in the future, and I hope you'll vote on June 3rd. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Susan Shelley. Thank you to Kevin Sparks for introducing Susan. And our next event